The whole town hated her, until this cowboy took a stand. The town was small enough that people could recognize a car by the sound of its engine. It sat between wide open fields and long, dusty roads that stretched toward the horizon. In the mornings, the air smelled like fresh hay and coffee drifting from kitchen windows. By afternoon, the sidewalks filled with neighbors greeting each other by name. Nothing stayed secret for long in a place like that. News traveled fast. Opinions traveled even faster. At the very edge of town, where the streetlights became fewer and the houses stood farther apart, there was a small white house with peeling paint and a wooden fence that leaned slightly to one side. That was where Clara Mitchell lived. Clara had not always been a mystery. Years ago, she and her husband had arrived together. They were polite, friendly, and hopeful. They attended church, waved at neighbors, and spoke about fixing up the old house they had bought. For a while, they fit in just fine, but then something changed. Her husband stopped being seen around town. At first, people assumed he was traveling for work. Then weeks turned into months. Clara stopped attending social events. She no longer stayed after church to talk. She kept her head down at the grocery store and paid quickly before walking back to her truck alone. That was when the whispers began. It started quietly, like most things do. Two women talking softly near the bakery counter, a man shaking his head at the gas station. Someone saying, "It's strange, don't you think?" No one had real information, but that didn't seem to matter. The less they knew, the more their imaginations filled in the blanks. Some said her husband must have left her because of something she had done. Others claimed they had heard raised voices from her house late at night. One person insisted she was hiding financial trouble. Another suggested something even darker, though they had no proof at all. Clara never defended herself. She never argued. She never explained. Her silence made people uncomfortable. In a town where everyone shared everything from family recipes to personal problems, her quiet nature felt suspicious. People began to see her as unfriendly, then cold, then untrustworthy. Children were told not to wander near her property. Just to be safe, their parents would say. Teenagers dared each other to knock on her door and run away. Laughter would echo down the road while Clara sat inside, unaware or pretending not to notice. But inside that small white house, life was far from mysterious. Clara woke before sunrise every day. She brewed a single cup of coffee and stood by the kitchen window, looking out at the fields as the sky slowly turned from dark blue to soft pink. The quiet of the early morning was the only time she felt at peace. It was the only time the world did not feel like it was watching her. After coffee, she worked. She fixed the broken fence board by board, using tools that once belonged to her husband. She mowed the lawn under the hot sun. When the porch steps became loose, she repaired them herself. Her hands grew rough and her shoulders ached, but she never asked for help. In the evenings, she would sit at the small kitchen table with a stack of letters beside her. Some were bills, others were old notes written in familiar handwriting. She would read them slowly, sometimes smiling, sometimes closing her eyes as if holding back tears. The town did not see those moments. They only saw what fit their story. At the grocery store, Clara moved carefully through the aisles. Conversations would quiet as she passed. Eyes followed her, though people pretended they were studying cereal boxes or checking their phones. She could feel it, the weight of being judged without a trial. Once she reached for a can on a high shelf and accidentally dropped it. The loud clang echoed across the store. Several heads turned at once. For a second, she froze, embarrassed. No one stepped forward to help. She bent down, picked it up herself, and placed it gently in her cart. The cashier offered a tight smile, polite but distant. Clara thanked her softly and left. Outside, she paused by her truck, gripping the steering wheel before starting the engine. It was not anger she felt. It was something heavier, something closer to loneliness. On Sundays, she still attended church, though she sat in the last row. The hymns sounded the same as they always had, but they felt different now. When people shook hands during the greeting, most turned to the person on their other side instead of facing her. She noticed. Of course she noticed. But she kept her head high and her expression calm. At night, when the town grew quiet, Clara sometimes walked out onto her porch and looked at the stars. The sky was wide and clear away from city lights. She used to stand there with her husband, pointing out constellations and talking about dreams for the future. Now she stood alone. There were days when she thought about leaving town altogether. packing her belongings into boxes, selling the house, and starting somewhere new where no one knew her name. But something always stopped her. This was still her home. She had planted flowers in the front yard with her own hands. She had painted the living room walls a soft blue because it reminded her of calm seas. She had memories woven into every corner of that house. Leaving would feel like giving up more than she already had. One afternoon, dark clouds rolled in unexpectedly. A storm swept across the fields with strong winds and heavy rain. Tree branches snapped. Trash cans tipped over. Clara watched from her window as part of her fence collapsed under the pressure. When the rain slowed, she didn't wait for help. She put on her old boots, grabbed a hammer, and stepped into the mud. Rain soaked through her jacket as she struggled to lift the broken wood. Her hair clung to her face, and her hands trembled from the cold. Across the road, a few neighbors watched from inside their warm homes. Some shook their heads. One even said she should have someone to help her. But no one crossed the street. Clara worked until the fence stood again, uneven but steady. By the time she went back inside, she was exhausted. She left muddy footprints on the kitchen floor and sank into a chair without even turning on the lights. The house felt quiet, too quiet. She closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of weakness. A single tear slid down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away as if someone might see. The next morning, life in town continued as usual. The bakery opened at 6. The diner filled with farmers discussing weather forecasts. Children waited for the school bus on corners. And the whispers continued. Did you see her out there in the storm? She's too proud to ask for help. Or maybe she doesn't want anyone too close. Every comment added another layer to the story people had built about her, yet none of them knew the truth. They didn't know about the long phone calls she had late at night, speaking in a soft voice filled with patience and encouragement. They didn't know about the hospital forms she had filled out alone. They didn't know about the promises she had made, promises to stay strong, to keep going, to hold things together no matter how heavy they felt. Clara carried her pain quietly because she believed some struggles were private. She believed dignity mattered. She believed that not every wound needed to be displayed to earn sympathy. But in a town that thrived on shared stories, her privacy looked like secrecy. Weeks passed, and the distance between Clara and the rest of the town seemed to grow wider. It was no longer just gossip. It was avoidance, a wall built from assumptions and silence. Still, Clara continued her routines. She fed the stray cat that lingered near her porch. She dropped off canned goods at the food drive without writing her name. She paid her bills on time. She kept her lawn neat. If anyone had looked closely, they would have seen not a villain, but a woman trying her best to survive difficult days with grace. But most people didn't look closely. They preferred the easier version of the story, the one that made sense without effort. In their minds, Clara Mitchell had become a symbol of something uncertain, something uncomfortable. And rather than admit they didn't understand her, they decided it was safer to judge her. And so, the small white house at the edge of town remained quiet. The woman inside it carried her burdens alone. The town moved on with its chatter and routine, unaware that the truth was far different from the tale they had created. They believed they knew her. They had no idea how wrong they were. Daniel Hayes was a man who moved through life quietly, but with a sense of purpose that people couldn't ignore. He lived on the outskirts of town, where the fields stretched wide and cattle grazed peacefully under the open sky. Unlike most of the townspeople, Daniel didn't spend his days worrying about gossip or rumors. He focused on work, honesty, and fairness. If someone needed help, Daniel offered it without hesitation, and if someone was being treated unfairly, he noticed it. Daniel had known the town his whole life. He remembered when Clara and her husband had first arrived. He had been polite to them, said hello when he saw them in the streets, and occasionally shared a word or two. He had watched the couple work on their home, saw their garden grow, and even helped them lift furniture once when they were moving in. He knew them as people who kept their word, who tried their best, and who valued quiet kindness over attention. Then the change had come. Her husband had left town and Clara had stayed behind. And just like that, the whispers started, as if the town itself had decided to turn against her. At first, Daniel didn't pay much attention. He was busy with his ranch, the animals, and everyday responsibilities. But slowly he began noticing something that unsettled him. People weren't just talking about Clara, they were assuming things about her. They were deciding she was guilty of something, untrustworthy, even unkind. and no one had ever stopped to ask her side of the story. Daniel saw her walking alone through the town on cold mornings, coat pulled tightly around her. He saw the way shopkeepers watched her approach, their eyes sharp with suspicion. He saw the children cross the street to avoid passing her house. He saw the judgment in people's glances, the way they whispered behind their hands. And he realized that no one, except maybe him, actually knew what she was like. Daniel wasn't a man to speak out without reason, but he had a strong sense of right and wrong. And what he saw felt wrong. It started with small acts. One morning he was driving past her house when he noticed the old fence had fallen down. Rain had made the ground muddy and the boards were scattered across the yard. He thought about stopping to offer help, but he didn't. He watched instead as Clara, alone, picked up each board and began fixing the fence herself. Rain poured down, soaking her jacket, flattening her hair against her face. Mud coated her boots and hands. Most people in town would have seen only her struggling and assumed she must be difficult, angry, or strange. But Daniel saw determination. He saw a woman caring for her home despite hardship. He saw courage. It wasn't just that moment. He noticed her feeding the stray cat that had appeared near her porch. He noticed her leaving small bags of food at the elderly neighbor's door when no one else thought to help. He noticed her volunteering at the animal shelter, quietly cleaning cages and preparing food, making sure the animals were comfortable. No one saw these things, and even if they did, they didn't comment. But Daniel did. Despite his awareness, Daniel stayed mostly quiet. He knew the town thrived on gossip and confrontation. Speaking out too soon could make him a target too. But he made a promise to himself. If anyone tried to harm Clara through lies or prejudice, he would act. Until then, he watched, collected facts, and prepared for the moment when truth would need a voice. That moment came sooner than he expected. It was a regular afternoon at the local diner, a place where townspeople gathered to talk about the weather, livestock, and small-town drama. Daniel had a cup of coffee and a plate of biscuits in front of him when a group of people at the next table began talking about Clara. Their voices were low at first, just under the hum of conversation. Then, as they gained confidence in the privacy of their corner, the words grew sharper. "I don't trust her," one woman said, tapping her fingers impatiently on the table. "She keeps to herself too much." "Something's off about her. She's probably hiding something," another added. "I've never seen her smile at anyone, never said a kind word unless she had to. She acts proud. I've heard about her past." "If she was normal, she would have told us everything already," a man said, shaking his head. Daniel sat still, listening. The words felt heavy, almost tangible, like smoke filling the small diner. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He simply listened and observed. As he sipped his coffee, he realized that not one person at the table had ever actually spoken to Clara. Not one. They had formed opinions entirely from appearances, whispers, and imagination. And yet, they spoke as if they knew her entirely. That was the moment Daniel made his decision. He wouldn't let the town's collective fear and judgment continue to shape someone's life. He wouldn't let them turn a quiet, kind, hardworking woman into a figure of suspicion and shame, not if he could prevent it. Daniel's stand didn't happen all at once. It built slowly, day by day, observation by observation. He began noting small details that proved Clara's true character. When she helped Mrs. Harper carry groceries up the stairs, he saw her strength. When she helped clean up after a storm damaged the community center, he saw her dedication. When she fixed her fence alone in the rain, he saw her determination. Each act was a piece of evidence. Each small gesture was a contradiction to the false image the town had created. But even with all the facts in front of him, Daniel understood the challenge. Changing people's minds in a town like this was never easy. People clung to stories they had repeated for years. They resisted the truth if it conflicted with their comfort or pride. Yet he believed in fairness, he believed in courage, and he believed that sometimes all it took was one person willing to speak up. He didn't confront anyone in anger, he didn't accuse. He waited for the right moment, observing carefully, preparing his words. He knew that a battle of tempers would not help. What mattered was clarity, evidence, and calm conviction. One evening, as he rode his horse along the field paths that separated his ranch from Clara's house, he thought about the town. He thought about how easily people judged others. He thought about how dangerous it could be to assume, to whisper, to repeat stories without understanding. And then he thought about Clara. She deserved better. Every small act he had witnessed, every quiet effort she had made deserved recognition. At the very least, she deserved a chance to be understood. Daniel spent the next few weeks paying close attention. He saw Clara helping the neighbor's elderly dog who had been sick, carrying warm blankets to someone whose house had cold drafts, even quietly helping a student from the school who had dropped books near the field. Each act confirmed what he already knew. The town had it wrong. Clara was not proud or secretive in a harmful way. She was cautious, private, and kind, and she carried responsibilities the town would never imagine. He also noticed the small ways she kept herself together, the routines that allowed her to survive loneliness. The mornings with coffee and sunlight, the careful attention to chores, the quiet evenings reading letters and writing notes. These were not the behaviors of a villain. They were the behaviors of someone fighting to maintain dignity and order in a world that had judged her unfairly. And Daniel began to see something else. The more the town judged her, the stronger she had become. They had tried to break her with words and whispers, but she endured. She didn't complain. She didn't lash out. She simply lived, doing what was right in her heart. That realization made his decision even firmer. He would act. And when he did, it would not be about him. It would not be about proving the town wrong. It would be about giving Clara the chance to be seen for who she really was. He would speak for truth and fairness because someone had to, and if he stayed silent, no one else would. The day finally came when the opportunity presented itself. It was at the town meeting, a place where people gathered to discuss land, events, and sometimes personal concerns. Daniel entered the room, aware that the topic of Clara had come up yet again. People were quietly murmuring her name, repeating stories that had long passed through rumor without question. Daniel felt the tension in the air. He felt the injustice like a weight pressing on his shoulders. He didn't hesitate. He quietly stood and asked the question everyone had ignored. "Has anyone here ever actually spoken to her?" The room went silent. Heads turned. Eyes darted around. People realized, perhaps for the first time, that they had been judging a woman they barely knew. Daniel's voice was calm but firm. He began to recount what he had seen, her kindness, her work ethic, her quiet generosity. He spoke of her courage and determination. He spoke of the small acts of service no one noticed, the long hours she spent helping others, and the dignity she carried despite being judged unfairly. No one interrupted. No one argued. Daniel simply spoke the truth. By the end, some people shifted uncomfortably. Some looked down. A few had tears in their eyes, realizing how wrong they had been. And in that silence, Daniel knew that change had begun. Not because he had shouted or demanded attention, but because he had been observant, fair, and brave enough to speak when no one else would. Daniel had taken a stand, and he had done it for someone who could not defend herself, someone who deserved the chance to be understood, someone who had lived quietly, courageously, and honestly despite being surrounded by whispers. The town would never forget that day. And neither would Clara, though she didn't yet know it, because sometimes seeing the truth depends on one person willing to open their eyes. And in Daniel Hayes, the town had found someone who could do just that. The town meeting hall was small and familiar. It was the place where people gathered to discuss local matters, like the upkeep of the main road, events at the community center, and sometimes disputes over land. The wooden floors creaked as people moved about. Folding chairs were arranged in rows, and the long windows let in the late afternoon sun, casting warm light across the room. For most days, the meetings were ordinary and predictable, but that afternoon it was different. Word had spread quietly, as rumors do, that Clara Mitchell's name might come up. Some townspeople were uneasy, unsure of what exactly they would hear. Others were eager, curious to see if the whispers they had repeated for years had any truth. Most had already made up their minds. In their minds, she had been unfriendly, secretive, and possibly guilty of things no one could prove. Daniel Hayes walked in quietly, taking a seat near the back of the hall. He had arrived early to observe, as he often did. His eyes scanned the room. Men and women of all ages were gathering, greeting each other with handshakes and nods, their faces reflecting both routine and subtle tension. Children sat with their parents, fidgeting, and the older members of the town adjusted their chairs as if preparing for a long discussion. For weeks, Daniel had thought about this moment. He had prepared mentally for what he would say and how he would say it. He knew that changing the minds of people who had long relied on gossip would not be easy. He also knew that clarity and calm conviction were more powerful than anger or confrontation. The meeting began as usual, with discussions about local projects, budgets, and upcoming events. People nodded, jotted notes, and raised hands politely when necessary. The room buzzed with quiet conversation. Then, almost inevitably, someone brought up community concerns. A pause fell over the room as a few people exchanged glances, and then the words came. "She's still living here," one woman said quietly, almost to herself, "and she refuses to be part of anything. Doesn't help with the town events, doesn't greet anyone properly. It's strange, don't you think?" "Yes," another person added. "She's too proud, always keeping to herself. I've heard things about her past." A third voice chimed in, sharper this time, louder. "Maybe she doesn't belong here. Maybe she should leave if she won't fit in. It's uncomfortable having someone like that in town." The murmurs spread, heads nodded in agreement. The tension in the room grew thick. Everyone seemed to want a voice and opinion at once, repeating bits of gossip and speculation they had heard from others. It was clear that no one had sought the truth. They were all repeating stories that had been retold and twisted over the years. Daniel remained quiet at first, listening to each accusation carefully. He observed the subtle signs of doubt, discomfort, and pride in the faces of his neighbors. He noticed the eagerness of some to judge and the hesitation of others who might have wondered privately whether their assumptions were fair. Then he stood up. The room grew instantly silent. Chairs scraped lightly against the floor as all eyes turned toward him. Even the murmur of conversation faded. Daniel's presence demanded attention, not because he was loud or angry, but because the weight of his quiet authority filled the space. People respected him, they trusted him, and they knew when he spoke it mattered. He looked around the room, his gaze steady and calm. "Has anyone here actually spoken to her?" he asked. The question was simple, clear, direct. A few people shifted uncomfortably, some avoided eye contact, a few shook their heads. Silence stretched across the room like a heavy curtain. Daniel took a deep breath and continued. "Has anyone here really asked her about her life, her choices, or the things she does every day? Has anyone tried to understand her before judging her? Because from what I've seen, no one has." He paused, letting his words sink in. The silence was heavy, uncomfortable for those who had been so quick to assume the worst. "I've watched her," Daniel said. "I've watched her in the mornings, standing in the rain, fixing her fence when no one else would help. I've seen her quietly volunteering at the animal shelter, cleaning cages, feeding the animals, making sure they were cared for. I've seen her helping neighbors in ways no one notices. I've seen her bring food to people who are struggling and take care of those who cannot take care of themselves." He walked slowly down the aisle, his hands relaxed at his sides. His voice remained calm, measured, and steady. "These are not the actions of someone proud or mean-spirited. These are the actions of a woman who cares, who works hard, and who has quietly faced difficulties that most of us could never imagine. And yet, we have all judged her. We have all decided without knowing that she is something she is not." Some faces in the room began to change. Surprise, doubt, and shame flickered across expressions. A few people whispered to one another, realizing that their certainty about Clara had been based on hearsay, not fact. Daniel continued. "We've made assumptions about her life. We've let stories and whispers fill in the blanks. But the truth is, assumptions are not facts. And fear, when left unchecked, becomes cruelty. We have been cruel to someone who has done nothing but live her life quietly, with dignity and kindness." A few people shifted in their chairs, ashamed. A couple of hands rose tentatively, as if asking to say something, but no words came. Daniel didn't need them to interrupt. He had already planted the seed of doubt in their minds. He simply needed them to think, to reflect, to see that the person they had judged was not the person they imagined. "I'm not asking you to like her," Daniel said. "I'm not asking you to forgive her for anything. I'm asking you to see her for what she is. A woman who has lived with courage, who has faced challenges quietly, and who deserves our respect simply because she is human." His words hung in the air. Some townspeople shifted uncomfortably, looking down at the floor. Some stared at Daniel, taking in his conviction. Others looked out the windows, avoiding the weight of the truth. Daniel's gaze softened. "We don't have to be friends with everyone. We don't have to agree with everyone. But we do have a responsibility to be fair. We do have a responsibility to speak the truth when it is needed. And today, the truth is that Clara Mitchell has been judged unfairly for far too long. He returned to his seat slowly, the room still quiet. The murmurs that had filled the space just moments ago had vanished. People were thinking, reflecting, questioning the certainty they had carried for years. One elderly woman who had been particularly vocal in the accusations sat still, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked down, then glanced up at Daniel, as if seeing the situation in a new light. Another man whispered to his neighbor, maybe we didn't know her after all. The silence stretched for a long moment. Then, quietly, a few people began nodding. A few whispered apologies were muttered. Some turned to each other with hesitant looks, unsure how to react but aware that Daniel's words were true. Outside the meeting hall, the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the town. The streets, which had been filled with gossip and assumption for years, seemed to feel a subtle change. The air was not heavier but lighter. People were thinking, questioning, and reflecting. Daniel stepped out into the cool evening air. He didn't wait for applause or recognition. He didn't seek attention or praise. He had spoken the truth because it was right, because someone had to, and that was enough. Across town, Clara Mitchell had no idea what had happened. She was at home, tending to her small garden, unaware that the walls of judgment surrounding her life had begun to crack. She had no idea that someone had finally seen her for who she truly was, and that was the point. Change often begins quietly. It begins with observation, with courage, and with someone willing to stand for what is right. Daniel's stand did not solve all problems. It did not erase years of whispered assumptions or repair the hurt inflicted by judgment, but it created a space for truth to enter. It gave people permission to see Clara as she really was, a woman of strength, kindness, and dignity. In the days that followed, small changes began to appear. A neighbor greeted her with a genuine smile. A local shopkeeper waved when she entered the store. Children were less hesitant to pass her house. People who had once been quick to assume the worst now hesitated, thinking twice before spreading rumors. It was not an immediate transformation, but it was the start of something bigger. Daniel Hayes had taken a stand, not for recognition, but for fairness. He had reminded the town that one person could make a difference, and he had reminded everyone that truth, when spoken calmly and firmly, has a power that no rumor can match. Clara Mitchell continued her quiet life, still tending to her home, helping others, and carrying her responsibilities with dignity. But now, slowly, the walls of judgment around her were beginning to crumble. And in that small, ordinary town, people began to understand that there is always more to someone than what gossip can reveal. Because sometimes, it only takes one person to open eyes, to speak truth, and to change the way an entire community sees another human being. And that day, Daniel Hayes did exactly that. After the town meeting, the small community began to change, almost imperceptibly at first. People went about their routines, but something had shifted. The words Daniel Hayes had spoken lingered in their minds. The quiet courage of Clara Mitchell, which had once been hidden behind layers of gossip and judgment, was now being seen, slowly but surely. It started with small gestures. One morning, Mrs. Harper, the elderly woman who lived a few streets over, walked up to Clara's house. She had always admired Clara from a distance but had never spoken directly to her. Today, however, she had mustered the courage. With a basket of freshly baked bread in her hands, she knocked gently on Clara's door. Clara opened the door, surprised but polite. "Good morning, Mrs. Harper," she said, her voice calm and warm. Mrs. Harper smiled a little shyly. I wanted to say thank you for everything you've done, for helping with the animals and for the food you've left for people who needed it. I never realized how much you've done quietly all this time." Clara felt her chest tighten. She had not expected recognition, not from anyone. "Thank you," she replied softly, unsure what else to say. This small encounter was the first crack in the wall of judgment that had surrounded her for years. Word of it spread quietly through the town, like a gentle wind blowing away the dust of old rumors. People began to notice things they had ignored before. The way Clara carried heavy buckets of water for her garden, the way she fixed her roof before the winter storms, the way she smiled softly at children passing by. Each observation added a new layer to the truth they had refused to see. One afternoon, a group of mothers from the school approached Clara. They had watched her from a distance for months, but never interacted directly. "We've seen you helping the students with their books and supplies," one mother said. We didn't understand before, but now we see how kind you are. Clara nodded, feeling warmth spread in her chest. "I just try to help where I can," she said. Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of years of effort and quiet courage. Meanwhile, Daniel Hayes continued to observe, but he no longer had to stand alone. Others began to follow his example. A few townspeople approached Clara, asking her questions about her past, wanting to understand her choices. Each conversation revealed the truth she had carried silently for so long. They learned that her husband had not abandoned her. He had fallen seriously ill and had gone away to receive long-term treatment, far from the town to maintain privacy. Clara had stayed behind to keep their home in order, to pay bills, and to manage responsibilities that no one else would handle for them. Her silence had not been pride or secrecy. It had been loyalty, love, and a desire to protect him. As the story became clearer, the town's perspective shifted dramatically. People realized that their assumptions had been not just wrong, but unfair. They had judged her without evidence, without understanding, and without compassion. The guilt and regret were palpable, though few knew how to express it at first. The changes were not immediate or complete, but they were steady and real. Invitations to community events started to include Clara. Children who once avoided her house now waved as they passed by. Even the grocery store cashier greeted her with warmth, no longer stiff and distant. One evening, Daniel visited Clara at her home. He brought with him a small basket of fresh vegetables from his farm. "I thought you might like some," he said simply. Clara smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you, Daniel, that's very kind of you." He shrugged, a small, humble gesture. "Just wanted to help. You've shown us all what quiet courage looks like. The town just needed to see it." Clara looked out her window at the fields beyond, the sky glowing with the colors of sunset. She had lived so many years under suspicion and judgment, yet here she was, slowly being understood. She realized that sometimes the truth only needed one person to speak it, and that person could change everything. As the weeks passed, more stories emerged about Clara's quiet acts of kindness. She had been helping a neighbor whose house had suffered damage in a storm. She had quietly paid for medical bills of someone in need. She had spent nights at the local animal shelter, caring for injured animals when no one else was available. Each revelation brought people closer to understanding the truth about her character. The town began to feel lighter. The heavy air of suspicion and judgment lifted gradually. Neighbors started greeting Clara in the streets. Conversations about her became positive instead of judgmental. People who had once whispered about her now shared stories of her kindness, generosity, and resilience. Clara herself felt a sense of relief she had never experienced before. She had endured years of isolation and suspicion, yet she had remained true to herself, quietly helping others, maintaining her home, and surviving with dignity. Now, finally, she was being seen not for the rumors that had followed her, but for the reality of her actions. One day, at the local community center, a small gathering was held in Clara's honor. It wasn't a formal celebration, but a simple acknowledgement. Daniel spoke briefly, recounting the courage and kindness Clara had shown over the years. Others shared their observations, their gratitude, and their apologies for having judged her too quickly. Clara listened quietly, her eyes glistening with tears. She had never expected recognition, yet she felt deeply moved by the acknowledgement. "I didn't do it for thanks," she said softly. "I only did what I felt was right." The townspeople nodded, understanding that her actions were not about recognition, but about integrity and compassion. They realized that her strength had always been quiet, unassuming, and consistent, and that strength had finally become visible to them. Over time, Clara became a respected member of the community, not because she sought it, but because her actions had earned it. People who had once avoided her now sought her advice, assistance, and company. Children played near her house without fear or hesitation. Neighbors invited her to meals, community gatherings, and simple visits. The town had transformed in its perception of her, moving from judgment to understanding, from suspicion to respect. Daniel Hayes continued his life on the ranch, humble as always. He didn't seek recognition for his role in changing the town's perception of Clara. But his actions had shown the power of courage, fairness, and speaking the truth. He had reminded the community that one person willing to stand for what is right can change the hearts and minds of many. As for Clara, she continued her quiet life, tending her garden, helping neighbors, caring for animals, and living with the dignity and kindness that had always defined her. But now, she did so without the weight of judgment pressing down on her. The town had finally seen her for who she truly was. The story of Clara Mitchell and Daniel Hayes became a quiet legend in the town, a reminder that assumptions can be wrong, that judgment without understanding is harmful, and that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to speak the truth to make a difference. The small white house at the edge of town, once a place of isolation and suspicion, now felt warm, welcoming, and alive. Clara's life, once shadowed by whispers and judgment, became a symbol of resilience, quiet courage, and the enduring power of kindness. And the town learned a valuable lesson, that everyone deserves to be seen and understood, not judged by whispers, rumors, or fear. That it takes courage to stand for someone else, and that truth, when spoken with calm confidence, can change an entire community. Years later, people still remembered that day in the town meeting, the day Daniel Hayes had spoken up. They remembered the small acts of kindness they had overlooked. They remembered the power of fairness and truth. And they remembered Clara Mitchell, not as the woman they had once feared or whispered about, but as a symbol of quiet courage, resilience, and the strength of a person who chose to live with integrity, even when the world had turned against her. Because sometimes, change begins with one voice. And sometimes, that voice is all it takes to transform fear and judgment into understanding and respect.